You know, people ask me all the time, what kind of a rod should I buy? So what we're going to do in this little video is just give you some basic ideas of the different characteristics of different rods, and then some things you might consider when you go into a store to purchase a rod. You know, also just remember that my opinions are my opinions, and although a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is just plain fact as far as how rods are built and that kind of stuff. What kind of rod you buy has a lot to do with your style, you know, what you want to feel when you're casting. And so we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But right now let's just talk about the characteristics of a rod. So I've got a little practice rod here that we're going to use as a demonstration rod. You know, the first thing that happens, different rods, they're constructed differently. Some rods bend all the way through the entire rod. This rod, for instance, if you look at the way this rod bends, it doesn't bend in the handle very much. So this rod is sort of a mid-flex, you'd call it, a mid-flex maybe. You'll see it bends into probably in the middle of the rod. You'd have to just get a heck of a lot of power to make this thing bend in the handle. So some rods are stiff all the way out to here, and then they bend a lot right there. Some rods, when you do what I just did, they'll bend all the way down. There are rods that you can feel bend in your hand when you pull the tip like this or when you cast. So just remember, a normal rod is of course 9 feet, and I'm just using this rod because it's convenient to show you some of the differences between rods. But so you've got different bend or different action on rods. Some rods, the action, the tip is faster, some rods it's slower. Some rods bend deeper in the butt, and some rods don't bend as deep in the butt. So those rods all make a difference in whether or not you can cast certain kinds of flies, or at least optimally. A good caster can take any rod, and no matter what rod they have, as long as they have a decent line on it that matches, and we'll talk about that more as we get into some of this tape, and it's part of what we're talking about when we talk about fly lines. But some rods, almost any rod, will cast pretty well for somebody who knows what they're doing. They just have to change their casting stroke, the rhythm, the speed, the application of power in order to make the rod behave well. So don't worry too much about what somebody else tells you about buying a rod. You've got to go feel rods, and if it happens to match your style, happens to match your personality. I even think rods have something to do with personality. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. Just remember that rods have different bends. Definitely a rod that tends to bend all the way down into the butt is going to be a slower rod. It's going to unbend slower when you stop a cast. That cast, it's going to take longer to unbend because it's got to unbend through a longer period of time. So you're going to have to wait a little bit longer for that rod to unbend. A rod that's really stiff all the way through here, and especially if you're using a small amount of line, it's going to bend just the tip. That tip doesn't take long to straighten. So the rhythm is going to be different. And you're going to have to just feel different rods. I know this as I've become a better caster. Yeah, I've started to migrate more and more towards a rod that is more of a middle of the road rod in terms of bend. I like a nice progressive bend, one where it's all evenly, it's going to bend. This kind of a bend would be my preference versus something that's really stiff and really it has almost a hinge effect at the tip, or something that's so noodly that it bends way down into the handle. But that's my personal preference. So you're going to have to decide what kind of a rod you want to get. Let's talk about length of a rod. Remember, you're dealing with a big, long lever. Let's just talk about the advantages and disadvantages of long rods. For instance, I own a 10-foot 4-weight rod that I can actually extend it out to 11 feet. That rod, because it's so long, it provides a really good lever for casting. The problem is that you know, it's any mistake you make down here is exaggerated tremendously at the very tip, because you got a 10-foot lever. The more error you make in your hand, the more error is going to be in the tip. And if you've looked at some of the rest of the videos, you're going to realize that even a small error with the tip creates a much greater error at the tip. An error at your hand creates a greater error at the tip. The shorter rod, by the same token, is going to be less likely to exaggerate your errors if you have a little bit of a problem. So the longer the rod has a lot of advantages. One big advantage of a long rod is you can cast farther, usually with a longer rod than a shorter rod, assuming everything else is equal. When I wade fish or go fishing on the flats, oftentimes I'll take a 9.5 or 10-foot rod. The disadvantage of that rod, and of course the reason I do that is because it gives me a greater lever off the ground so I can get more line in the air to cast farther. The disadvantage of that rod is that it makes it harder to catch a fish. If you think about picking up a broom handle, and let's say this is the broom right here, and let's say that this is a push broom, and if you try to pick it up here with your arms straight out like this, it'd be really hard to do. You'd have to get close to the handle. The closer you get to the handle, the easier it is to pick it up. Well, it's the same thing with a fish. If I'm here and you've got a big fish out here and you've got a stiff long rod, you're trying to lift that rod with it's tough to do because your lever is so long. You're trying to lift this thing way away from your hand. If you look at deep sea rods where those guys are fishing for, 300-pound fish at the bottom of the ocean, they're short, they're 5 feet long. They're basically pulling a fish up by their hands, which would be much more efficient. So a big long rod is going to be less efficient as a fish fighter, as would a stiff rod. So one of the things with stiff rods aren't going to bend as much. If you've got a 9-foot rod that bends all the way down to the handle, it's going to be a better fish fighter than a stiff rod that doesn't bend at all except for the tip, because you're going to have that fight way away from your hand. Your leverage is going to be less. So those are considerations with a long rod versus a short rod. Obviously I like a longer rod in most situations, even in smaller streams. And that is debatable. A lot of people disagree with me. But in a small stream, oftentimes you've got the water flowing around. Let's say you're downstream and you're fishing upstream. The water's going along and then it falls off a little drop off, a little waterfall, maybe just from a tail out into another pool. That water right there is going pretty fast. If I can't keep my fly line over that little drop off, that lip, then it pulls my fly immediately, unless I put some dump casts and stuff upstream. So I like a longer lever because I can control it better in terms of high sticking when I'm fishing. Some of those things you're going to see on some of these video series too. That's my personal preference. I don't like fishing with small rods. It's hard to mend. It's hard to control the fly line with a small rod at any distance from you at all. Even at shorter distances, if something's just 10, 12 feet away, a 5, 6 foot 7 rod, I just don't like them. But if you like short rods for little bitty places, my feeling is you get into a tight little choky stream, which we have in Southern California and places in the Appalachians and the Ozarks and those kinds of places, you may want a short rod. Me personally, I'd rather have a long rod and do a bow and arrow cast, because I think that's going to give me a chance when I get into other areas of the stream which are more open. I'm going to be able to cast better with it. And when I say a long rod, I'm talking about an 8.5 foot rod, an 8-foot rod in those kinds of conditions. I'm not talking about a 15-foot rod. So rod length is an important consideration. My suggestion is, for most applications, an 8.5 foot, 9-foot rod is just perfect for most applications. There are occasional, if you're going to fish a lot like I do with nymph streams, where I'm doing some high sticking, I'm going to want a big long rod because I can reach farther, I can keep the fly line off the water, and I can keep the fly from dragging. So, it just depends on where you're fishing. We'll talk about that more later. The weight of the rod. When we talk about a weight, a 1-weight rod is really small. It's very small. It has a 1-weight line. It matches to the rod. A 12 or a 14 or even a 15-weight rod is much thicker. You're talking about a 15-weight rod is made for casting big flies, big lines to things like sailfish, You know, those kinds of big things. 12, 11, 10 weight rods are for tarpon. You know, you get into a 9-weight rod, maybe for big snook, big redfish, really windy conditions. So the weight of the rod is important. If you're going to be doing a lot of fishing in the surf in Southern California with the wind blowing, and you're trying to cast sink tip lines into the waves, then you may want a 9-weight rod or a 6-weight rod, depending on how good you are and how much you want to work. So the weight of the rod is important. Just remember that all rods' weights are fairly relative. I know this, that I've got rods that are, let's say, a 7-weight rod, which is a sort of a medium rod in terms of its power and its size and its weight, and I match it sometimes with a 7-weight line and sometimes with an 8-weight line. I've even got an 8-weight rod that I match with a 10-weight line in certain circumstances, because that 10-weight line bends the rod at really short distances. So let's just talk about, we're talking about the bend and about the weight of the rod and the line really quickly. Remember that what bends this rod, what loads this rod, and if you go back to some of the original tapes in chapter number 1, you're going to see what we talk about rod bend or rod load. What bends this rod is the weight of the line against the motion of the rod. What happens if I've got a very light line? Well, then I need a lot of length of that line out to bend the rod versus the same rod with half the length but twice the weight. So if I need 180 grains of line to bend a rod sufficiently to really get a good cast, then if I use a lighter line, instead of using 30 feet, I may need 40 feet of line in order to get that same amount of weight. Or I could use 20 feet with a line that weighs more than that, 190 or 200 grains. So rod weight and line is a relative kind of thing depending on what you're trying to do. I usually overweight my rods with heavier lines for all of my little trout fishing in rivers that are 40, 50, 60 feet. I want to load that rod at a very short distance because remember, I've got a 7 or 8 or 9 foot leader on it, and I've got a 9-foot rod. So I'm already out at 17 feet without any fly line. I want to have a fly line that's heavier than my rod is supposed to carry because it bends my rod sooner. So those are some considerations we'll talk about, but you need to consider that. And when you go to a fly shop, hopefully you get somebody that really knows what they're doing and they can help you understand how to match a line to a rod. The other thing is the cost. You know, in today's modern world, cost is not a serious issue. You do not have to buy a $900 rod. Let's just talk about what makes the difference between a $900 rod and a $200 rod. Some of it is the brand spankinest, newest technology, which they've had to spend a lot of money on. So that's why they spend that's how they charge $900 for a rod, because they took a lot of work and time to develop a rod. That rod is probably, at least for somebody who's really good, a little bit better than the previous generation of rod. It probably, when you get done with the cast and it straightens out, it doesn't bounce back and forth as much. So that would be one advantage of a more expensive rod possibly. When you make a cast forward and back, it doesn't tend to do this. It tends to go in a straight line. So that would be an advantage of a rod. Other things that cause a rod to cost more or less, besides just the technology that goes into it, is the makeup of the handle and the different things that are on it, the guides, the ferrules, the the rod seat or the reel seat, all that stuff. If it's made out of very expensive materials that are, for instance, salt proof or salt resistant at least, it's going to cost you more than a rod that doesn't have those kinds of materials in it. So rods, the basic, I would say this, that in modern day rods, if you buy a $250 rod now, it's got technology that was probably at the very, very worst, the best technology you could spend or you could get in 2010. So it's like computers. If you went and bought yourself a $200 computer right now, or a $400 computer, let's say, you're getting quite a bit of computer. If you buy a $1,500 computer, you're getting more, but whether or not that's really important for the average person who's just basically sending emails and you know, looking at a few YouTube videos, it may not be really worth it. So it's the same thing with the rod. My suggestion is, this is how I would go about buying a rod. Number one, consider what kind of fishing you're going to do. If you're mostly trout fishing in the West, hey, you buy a $200, $300, $400 rod. I mean, if you got tons of money, hey, buy a really super rod. But a $200, $300, $400 rod with most of the major manufacturers now is going to be just fine. It's going to perform just perfectly adequately for trout fishing under most circumstances. And it's going to have plenty of the little gizmos on it that are going to allow you to catch fish. So I wouldn't spend a ton of money unless you really want to. Now, what size rod should you buy? If you're in Wyoming and you're fishing 30, 40, 50-foot streams and once in a while maybe making a cast of 55 or 60 feet, a 6-weight rod is probably fine, a 5-weight rod, even a 4-weight rod if you're a good caster. But considering how much wind you're going to have, the more wind you have, the more difficult it is to cast with a lighter rod because the line has less mass and doesn't behave in the wind as well. The other thing that you have to consider when you're buying a smaller rod is that it's not going to cast as easily big stuff. So if you're casting nymphs with an indicator, 2 split shot, and a couple of weighted nymphs, you don't want probably a 3-weight rod unless you're a really good caster and you don't have to worry about the wind. If you're going to occasionally throw a streamer, then you probably don't want a 3 or 4-weight rod, especially if the streamer's got any kind of size. If you're going to throw a sink tip line, so there's a lot of limitations if you buy a 4 or 5-weight rod. I personally don't see the giant thrill of casting. I mean, I've got a 2-weight rod. I've got 3-weight rods, 4-weight rods, 5-weight rods. My feeling is I would rather have too much rod than too little when I go out on the stream. So if I'm in doubt, I'll bring my 5-weight, even though I think I could get away with a 3. You know, or I'll bring my 7-weight, even though I think I could get away with a 5 or a 6. The bottom line is I want to make sure that regardless of how bad the wind comes up, regardless of what I decide to throw that day, I'm going to be able to throw it because I have an adequate rod to do that with. So my suggestion is if you go to a fly shop and somebody says, oh, just buy a 4-weight rod for Montana, you're pretty much stuck on fairly windless days for the average caster, fairly windless days without much weight at pretty short distances. And what you get on the Madison River and your guide asks you to throw a streamer or a nymph rig in a wind with a 4-weight, 40 feet even, it's going to be a real struggle. So my suggestion would be, for instance, in that situation, buy a 6-weight. In terms of flats fishing, if you're going to be mostly flats fishing or fishing out of a flats boat, you're just hanging around in Florida and that's kind of what you're doing, I would suggest a 7 or an 8-weight. Again, 6 weights, I use 6 weights on a flat quite often, but if I had to, when I go to the Bahamas, I bring an 8 and a 9-weight along with my 7-weight because sometimes the wind is howling. Sometimes I want to make big long casts in a wind. Again, I want to be over rodded rather than under rodded. So if you got one rod to buy an 8-weight. You can go bass fishing with it in the bass ponds in Florida and Georgia and wherever else you're going. You can smallmouth bass fish in the Northeast. You can do all kinds of things with an 8-weight. If I had 2 rods to buy for 90% of the fishing that I do, I'd buy a 6 and an 8-weight, or maybe a 5 and a 7-weight. So those would be the rods that I find most useful. Now, if you're going to be fishing for big, huge fish, you know, maybe if you're steelhead fishing, you may want to have an 8 or a 9-weight, depending on what you're doing. So it just depends on what you're doing, but you need to think about it. So let's talk about going into the store. What do you do when you go in the store? Here's the advice I give people when they go in the store. When you go in that store, you ask the person, and you've already got, you have in mind what kind of rod you want to buy. I want to buy a 6 or a 7-weight. I want to buy a fairly fast or slow action. Me personally, I like a medium fast action rod. It's a little more forgiving. It doesn't cause tailing loops as easily as a soft rod that bends down in a handle. And it still has enough power to throw stuff, but I can feel it. I love to feel a rod bend. So let's assume you've decided what you really want. And I would suggest before you buy one, see if you can't get someplace and just cast a bunch of rods. When you're time to buy, go into the store, and if you've got money and you've got the ability to buy whatever rod's on the shelf, I would suggest what you do is you ask them to take off the price tag. Don't even look at the price tag, because that can bias you into buying a rod that isn't the best rod, or not buying a rod that is the best rod because it's, quote, a cheap rod. Just go out. When I used to help out in a fly shop, I used to go out and just tell the person, hey, cast this rod. Let them cast it. Now cast this rod, rod 2. Which one do you like better? Which feels better when you cast it? I like rod 2 better. Good. Cast it again. Now here's rod 3. Put rod 1 away. Here's rod 3. What do you like better between 2 and 3? Ooh, I like 2. It's kind of like going to the eye doctor and they say, what's clear? 1 or 2, 2 or 3, 3 or 4. It's the same kind of thing. Just keep going until you get down to the final 2 rods. Cast them a little bit. Cast them at different distances. Cast them at 10 feet. Cast them at 40 feet. Cast them at 50 feet. Maybe use a double haul if you can double haul. Do some curve casts and some reach mends. Figure out which rod feels best to you, and then that's the one you buy if you can afford it. Now, if your budget is $500, then tell them, I want all the rods that you have on a 6-weight from $500 and less, and then pick one of them. If you've got an unlimited budget, then tell them that I want every 6-weight rod you have. Go out, try not to look at the label, don't look at anything, just cast the rod. So you might also, have them put different lines on it. Can you put a heavier line on it or a lighter line on it? So rod choosing, I hope this helped a little bit with figuring out how to choose a rod. I know it's kind of long, but there's a lot of stuff in picking out a rod, and I hope that helps you. Please, if you feel free to contact me through the YouTube channel. If you have a specific question, I'll try to answer it. So good luck.